Camp Trinidad, Colorado, September 1945. The mess hall stood at the compound center, windows glowing gold in the pre-dawn darkness, steam rising from kitchen vents into mountain air that carried the scent of pine and cooking bacon. 16 boys sat at wooden tables, none older than 17, most younger, hands folded in laps, backs rigid with fear. Before them, American soldiers placed plates laden with eggs and toast and meat, more food than these children had seen in years. But the boys didn't eat. They stared at the abundance with hollow eyes and understood it was a test, perhaps the final test before whatever punishment. Americans had planned for enemy soldiers who should have been in school instead of war. What happened in the next hour would teach them that everything the regime had promised about American cruelty was a lie. But first, they had to believe they would survive long enough to take that first bite. Hans Becker was 15 years old when the regime conscripted him. Not voluntarily recruited or persuaded conscripted, pulled from his Hamburg classroom in January 1945, along with every other boy in his school who was 14 or older. The German leadership had run out of men, had already sent fathers and uncles and older brothers to fight on multiple fronts, and now needed children to fill the gaps in lines that were collapsing faster than propaganda could explain away. They had given him 6 weeks of training, 6 weeks to learn how to fire a rifle, how to dig a foxhole, how to follow orders without question. 6 weeks to transform from a boy who had been studying mathematics and literature into a soldier expected to hold positions against enemies who had years of combat experience and equipment that seemed to arrive in endless quantities. The training had been harsh, but not brutal. The regime's forces were too desperate for bodies to waste time on excessive discipline. They taught him to shoot, to march, to obey commands. They fed him barely adequate rations and told him that deprivation was temporary, that Germany was on the verge of deploying new weapons that would reverse the war's momentum, that his sacrifice would be remembered when final victory came. Hans had believed, because belief was easier than acknowledging reality. His mother had cried when they took him, had held him at the doorway of their apartment, and whispered that he should survive, that survival mattered, more than victory or honor, or any of the things the regime claimed were worth dying for. But Hans had been 15 and male, and raised on stories of German military glory, and part of him had wanted to prove himself worthy of those stories. The reality had been different. He had been assigned to a unit defending what remained of German positions in the West, facing American forces that advanced with machinery and supplies that seemed infinite. Hans had spent 3 weeks in a trench system outside a town whose name he never learned, eating diminished rations and listening to artillery that came closer every day, watching older soldiers, men in their 30s, who should have been experienced veterans, reveal through their fear that the war was lost, and everyone knew it except perhaps the leadership in Berlin, who kept issuing orders to hold positions that could not be held. The Americans had come with tanks. Hans remembered the sound more than the sight engines that roared and treads that crushed earth, and the particular metallic clank of armor moving with purpose. His unit had tried to fight, but their equipment was inadequate and their ammunition scarce and their training insufficient for the reality of combat against forces that had been fighting for years. Hans had surrendered with 30 other soldiers, most of them teenagers like himself, emerging from trenches with hands raised in uniforms that were too large or too small because the regime had stopped bothering with proper sizing when it started conscripting children. The American soldiers who had processed them had looked disturbed, not angry or cruel, but unsettled by the youth of the prisoners they were taking, by the evidence that Germany had become desperate enough to send children into combat. Ernst Gottlieb was 14, just 14, with a face that still carried baby fat and hands that had never fully recovered from frostbite sustained during his single week of combat in March 1945. He had been pulled from a Berlin school when the regime had lowered the conscription age. One final time, when any boy who could hold a rifle was considered military age, regardless of whether he had finished puberty or learned to shave. Ernst's parents had tried to hide him, had sent him to relatives in the countryside, had forged papers claiming medical exemption. But the regime's agents had been thorough in their desperation, had searched systematically for every possible recruit, and Ernst had been found and taken and given 3 weeks of training that mostly consisted of learning to follow orders and not ask questions. He had fought for 1 week. 1 week in the ruins of a German city whose name he could not remember clearly because trauma and fear had blurred his memories into impressions rather than clear recollections. 1 week of hiding in buildings while artillery destroyed everything around him, of following orders that made no strategic sense, of watching other child soldiers panic or freeze or weep with fear. His surrender had been accidental. He had been separated from his unit, had wandered into American lines while looking for a position that no longer existed, had been captured by soldiers who had initially thought he was a civilian child until they noticed his uniform and rifle. The Americans had given him food and water and treated his frostbitten hands, and Ernst had realized with shock that these enemies were showing him more care than his own forces had demonstrated during training. Karl Weber was 16, but looked 12 malnutrition, and stress had stunted his growth and made him appear much younger than his years. He had been conscripted in February from a Munich school, had received 5 weeks of training that emphasized ideology more than practical military skills, and had been assigned to a unit that existed primarily on paper, assembled from whatever bodies the regime could scrape together, regardless of age or fitness. Karl had been raised in a family that was quietly critical of the regime. His father had expressed doubts about the war's conduct. His mother had worried openly about what was happening to Germany. But such doubts had to remain private, whispered in kitchens rather than spoken in public, because open criticism meant consequences for the entire family. So Karl had gone when called, had learned to shoot and march and salute, had kept his doubts to himself because survival meant compliance. His combat experience had lasted 9 days. 9 days of retreating positions and diminishing supplies, and officers who issued contradictory orders that revealed their own confusion and desperation. Karl had been captured when his unit had simply dissolved soldiers walking away from positions they couldn't hold, surrendering in groups or individually acknowledging through action what couldn't be said aloud, that the war was over and continuing to fight meant dying for a regime that had already lost. These 3 boys, Hans, Ernst, Karl, found themselves processed together through the American prisoner system. They had been photographed, fingerprinted, given medical examinations that revealed malnutrition and minor injuries and the general state of bodies that had been asked to do more than teenage frames could sustain. They had been questioned briefly, though the Americans seemed less interested in intelligence from children than in understanding how desperate Germany had become. Then came the journey across the Atlantic, a transport ship, crowded but not inhumane, crossing an ocean that Hans had only seen in photographs. The voyage took 2 weeks, and during that time, the boys began to understand that American capacity was real rather than propaganda. The ship was well maintained. Food was adequate. Medical care was available for those who needed it. Everything functioned with an efficiency that German logistics had never demonstrated during the boys' brief military service. They arrived at a port in Virginia, were loaded onto trains, and traveled across American landscape that seemed impossible in its scale. Hans stared out windows at forests that went on for hours, at cities that showed no bombing damage, at farmland that stretched to horizons without evidence of combat or destruction. This was the nation they had been told was collapsing under war strain. The enemy that propaganda had claimed was weak and disorganized, and on the verge of internal collapse. Camp Trinidad sat in Colorado mountains, a facility that had been built to house German prisoners captured in North Africa and Europe. The camp was larger than any military installation the boys had seen in Germany, row after row of wooden barracks, guard towers at regular intervals, wire fencing that looked more symbolic than truly imprisoning. The September air was thin and cold at altitude, carrying the scent of pine in approaching autumn. They were processed again, issued prison clothing, assigned barracks, given identification numbers. The American soldiers who handled processing were professional but not friendly, maintaining appropriate distance between captors and captives. They explained rules in German. Several guards spoke the language fluently, some from German family backgrounds, others trained specifically for working with prisoners. The barracks were heated. This registered slowly, competing with exhaustion and uncertainty for the boys' attention. Wooden bunks with actual mattresses, blankets that were clean and adequate for mountain cold, windows that had glass rather than boards. The space was institutional, but not deliberately harsh, designed for basic comfort rather than punishment. Hans took a bunk and lay down, feeling the mattress beneath him thin but present, better than the ground he had slept on during combat, better than the cramped ship transport. Around him, other boys were settling in with the same careful uncertainty, testing boundaries through small actions, trying to understand what kind of captivity this would be. That first evening, they were fed in their barracks bread and soup brought in large containers by American soldiers who ladled portions into the tin bowls each prisoner had been issued. The bread was white, soft, nothing like the dense gray loaves that had been standard in Germany. The soup was thin but hot, containing actual vegetables and something that might have been beef. It was more food than the boys had typically received during training or combat, served without ceremony or comment. Hans ate slowly, watching the American guards for signs of what would come next. Would the decent treatment continue, or was this preliminary kindness before harsher conditions began? The regime's propaganda had prepared him for American cruelty, torture, starvation, deliberate mistreatment of prisoners. But the propaganda had also promised German victory, and German victory had clearly not materialized. So which promises were lies and which were truth? He fell asleep not knowing, exhausted beyond fear, his body demanding rest regardless of what morning might bring. Dawn came early to the Colorado mountains, light spilling across peaks and into valleys where morning mist still clung to lower elevations. The camp bell rang at 0600, waking prisoners to a day whose structure they didn't yet understand. American guards moved through barracks, using German phrases to direct boys toward morning routines, washing, dressing, preparing for whatever came next. Hans and the others were formed into groups, marched across the compound toward a building that had been identified during orientation as the mess hall. The morning air was cold enough to show breath, and Hans shivered in his prison clothes, wishing for the heavier jacket he had lost somewhere during surrender and transport. The mess hall loomed before them larger than any dining facility Hans had seen in military service, its windows glowing with electric light against the morning's remaining darkness. The building smelled of food, of cooking that carried scents Hans recognized but couldn't quite place, familiar from some distant memory of peacetime normalcy. They entered through double doors into warmth and light. The space was enormous long tables with attached benches stretching down the room's length, each table set with metal trays and utensils. At the far end, a serving line steamed and clattered with food preparation. American soldiers in kitchen duty working behind industrial equipment that produced breakfast for hundreds of prisoners. Hans stared. He had expected minimal rations, enough to sustain life, but nothing more. This looked like actual dining, like the meal service was meant to feed people rather than merely prevent starvation. But that made no sense. Why would Americans waste resources feeding enemy prisoners better than necessary? The line moved forward. Boys shuffled toward serving stations, uncertain and cautious, watching the Americans for signals about what was expected. An American sergeant stood near the entrance, arms crossed, observing the morning routine with professional detachment. When he noticed the boys' hesitation, he spoke in German that was accented but clear. "Go ahead," he said. gesturing toward the serving line. "Get your breakfast. You'll need it for morning work detail." Hans moved forward because orders were easier to follow than independent decisions. He picked up a tray metal, divided into sections, clean and still slightly warm from washing. He moved down the serving line behind Ernst, who was in front of him, and Karl, who was somewhere further ahead. The first station held eggs. Scrambled eggs, piled in a large metal container, steaming and yellow and absolutely real. An American soldier behind the counter ladled a generous portion onto Hans's tray without comment or expression. The eggs smelled like eggs, not like powder or substitute, actual chicken eggs that required hens and feed and agricultural infrastructure. The next station was meat. Bacon and sausage, both available, the bacon crispy and the sausage lynx brown and glistening with fat. Hans stared at meat portions that represented more protein than he had typically eaten in a week during training. The American soldier serving added both to his tray, bacon overlapping with sausage, casual abundance that seemed impossible. Then came toast. White bread, sliced and griddled with butter, stacked in rows that suggested unlimited supply. Hans received 2 slices, and the soldier gestured toward butter dishes on the tables if he wanted more. Butter, additional butter. As if butter were so plentiful, it could be offered optionally rather than carefully rationed. The final station held fruit. Fresh apples, oranges that looked like they had come from California or Florida, or wherever Americans grew oranges. And something Hans didn't recognize until he was closer: bananas, yellow and bright, a tropical fruit he had only seen in photographs from before the war. An apple was placed on his tray. Then, because the soldier serving noticed Hans staring at the bananas, a banana was added as well. The soldier smiled slightly, not mockingly, but with something like understanding, and said in German, "First time seeing a banana?" Hans nodded, unable to speak. "Take it," the soldier said. "Plenty more where that came from." Hans moved to the end of the line, where coffee and milk were available in large urns. He took coffee, real coffee. He could smell it, not ersatz and added milk, because it was there, and he hadn't tasted real milk in months. And he stood holding his tray, looking at more food than he had eaten in any single meal since conscription, and felt his hands begin to tremble. Around him, the other boys were experiencing similar paralysis. Ernst stood frozen at a table, staring at his full tray. Karl had sat down, but hadn't touched his food, his eyes moving from plate to guards to windows, as if expecting something to happen. Across the mess hall, dozens of German child prisoners stood or sat with loaded trays, none of them eating, all of them waiting for the trap they knew must be coming. The American sergeant who had spoken earlier noticed the stillness. He walked down the center aisle, observing boys who weren't eating, reading the fear that was obvious despite their attempts to hide it. He stopped in the middle of the room and spoke loudly in German, his voice carrying authority, but not anger. "You can eat," he said. "This is your breakfast. It's not a trick. It's not poisoned. This is what prisoners receive every morning. You will eat, you will work, you will be treated according to international law. If you don't eat, you'll be hungry during work detail, which won't be pleasant. So eat your breakfast." No one moved. The sergeant sighed, walked to the nearest table where a boy sat frozen, picked up the boy's fork, took a bite of the eggs himself, chewed, swallowed, and set the fork back down. "See," he said, "not poisoned, just eggs. Now eat." The boy, not Hans, someone younger, maybe 13, picked up his fork with shaking hands and took a small bite of eggs. He chewed slowly, as if testing for poison or traps, then swallowed. When nothing happened, when no Americans laughed or punished or revealed cruel intentions, he took another bite. Slowly, hesitantly, other boys began eating. Hans watched Ernst take his first bite of bacon, saw the way Ernst's eyes widened at the taste of real meat after months of inadequate protein. He watched Karl cut into a sausage link, saw Karl's hand tremble as he brought it to his mouth. Hans looked down at his own tray. The eggs were still steaming slightly. The bacon glistened with fat his body desperately needed. The toast was perfectly browned, butter melting into its surface. The apple shone red and perfect. The banana sat yellow and strange and exotic on the tray's edge. He picked up his fork and took a bite of eggs. The flavor exploded across his tongue, salt and butter, and the rich completeness of actual eggs, not powder or substitute, but real food prepared properly. He had forgotten food could taste like this. In his months of military service, everything had been bland or unpleasant or barely identifiable. This tasted like memory, like peacetime, like mornings in Hamburg before the war had consumed everything. He ate the eggs quickly, unable to stop himself, his body taking over from his mind and demanding the nutrition it had been denied. Then the bacon, crispy and rich with fat that his starving frame recognized as precisely what it needed. Then the sausage and the toast, and finally the apple, sweet and tart and crisp with juice that ran down his chin. The banana sat on his tray, strange and yellow. Hans had never eaten a banana, didn't know how to approach it. He watched other boys puzzling over the same problem, until one of the older prisoners, someone who must have lived somewhere tropical before the war, demonstrated, peeling away the thick skin to reveal the white fruit inside. Hans peeled his banana clumsily and bit into it. The texture was strange, soft, and almost creamy, with a sweetness that was nothing like German fruits. But it was good, filling, and the strangeness made it feel even more foreign and abundant and American. He finished everything on his tray, then sat back feeling full for the first time since conscription. Around him, other boys were doing the same, finishing meals that represented more calories and better nutrition than they had received in weeks or months. The mess hall filled with the sounds of eating forks, on metal quiet conversations in German, as boys confirmed with each other that this was real, that the food was safe, that perhaps American captivity would be different from what propaganda had promised. The American sergeant was watching with an expression that Hans couldn't quite read, not satisfaction exactly, but something like relief, as if seeing starved children eat properly mattered to him in ways that weren't purely professional. When most boys had finished, the sergeant spoke again. "That's breakfast," he said in his accented German. "Every morning, same time. You eat well, you work well, you follow rules, you'll be treated fairly. This is America. We don't starve prisoners, we don't torture children, we don't do the things you were told we would do. Understand?" Heads nodded slowly. Understanding was beginning, though belief would take longer. They had been fed, genuinely fed, given meals that proved American abundance was real rather than propaganda. But one meal wasn't proof against years of indoctrination. One breakfast didn't erase months of being told that Americans were cruel enemies who would show no mercy to captured German soldiers. Still, Hans thought as he stood to return his tray, it was a beginning. Evidence accumulated. And if breakfast was real, if the heated barracks were real, if the fair treatment was real, then perhaps everything else they had been taught about America and Germany and the war itself had also been lies. The work detail was nothing like Hans had expected. He and the other boys were assigned to light maintenance tasks, raking leaves, cleaning barracks, helping in the carpentry shop where broken furniture was repaired. The work was neither difficult nor punishing, just basic labor to keep the camp functioning and give prisoners structured activity during daylight hours. An American corporal named Henderson supervised Hans's group. Henderson spoke minimal German, but communicated effectively through demonstration and patience, showing boys how to use tools properly, correcting mistakes without anger, occasionally joking in English that none of them understood, but whose tone suggested friendliness rather than mockery. The second morning brought another full breakfast. Eggs again, this time with ham instead of bacon, toast and butter, fresh fruit, apples and oranges, real coffee. The same abundance, served with the same casual efficiency, as if feeding starved German children was unremarkable rather than extraordinary. Ernst ate more slowly this time, savoring rather than frantically consuming. He had been sick the previous evening. His shrunken stomach had rebelled against sudden abundance. But his body was adjusting, and he was learning to pace himself. The food was real, would keep coming, didn't need to be consumed in panicked urgency. Carl observed the Americans carefully, trying to understand them. The guards were professional, but not cruel. The kitchen staff served food without commentary or judgment. The officers who occasionally walked through the mess hall looked at the German boys with expressions that seemed more like pity than hatred. None of it matched what the regime had taught about American nature and intentions. By the end of the first week, breakfast had become routine. The boys woke to the 0600 bell, washed and dressed, formed lines to the mess hall, received their trays, and ate meals that would have seemed lavish in wartime Germany. They began to talk during breakfast, quiet conversations in German about home and families and the strange reality of captivity. That felt less like imprisonment than like institutional care. Hans found himself thinking about his mother's warning survive. She had said survival mattered more than ideology or glory. She had understood something he was only beginning to grasp, that the regime had lied systematically about everything, that American cruelty was propaganda rather than truth, that German superiority had been mythology built on nothing substantial. An American chaplain visited the camp, a Lutheran minister from Minnesota, who spoke fluent German and offered religious services for prisoners who wanted them. Hans attended, not from faith, but from curiosity about Americans who would provide religious accommodation to enemy prisoners. The chaplain's sermon was about mercy and reconstruction, about the necessity of moving beyond hatred toward building something better from the ruins of conflict. After the service, the chaplain spoke with individual boys, asking about their families and backgrounds and how they were adjusting to captivity. When he reached Hans, he asked simply, "Are they treating you well?" Hans considered the question. He was warm, fed, given medical care for minor injuries, assigned work that wasn't excessive. He was a prisoner, but a prisoner who received better treatment than he had gotten as a soldier in his own army. Better treatment than many German civilians were receiving in bombed-out cities, facing food shortages and infrastructure collapse. "Yes," Hans said finally. "Better than I expected." The chaplain nodded. "Many of you boys were sent to fight before you were ready. That wasn't fair to you. We're not going to compound that unfairness with cruelty. You'll be here for a while, then eventually you'll go home. When you do, you'll remember this, that Americans treated you with basic human decency. And maybe that memory will help Germany build something better." Hans thought about that conversation during work details, during meals, during evenings when boys gathered in barracks to talk and play cards and try to maintain some sense of normalcy in their strange situation. The chaplain was right, memory would persist. Hans would remember that Americans had fed starving children, had provided warmth and shelter and care to enemies who had been shooting at American soldiers weeks earlier. That memory would shape how he understood the war, would inform whatever came after. By October, the breakfast routine had become so normal that Hans sometimes forgot to marvel at it. Eggs and meat and toast and fruit and coffee, just breakfast, served daily, unremarkable in its consistency. But occasionally, usually when he noticed new prisoners arriving and experiencing the same shock he had felt that first morning, Hans would remember what it meant. The abundance was proof that American industrial capacity was real, that agricultural production was genuine, that the nation Germany had challenged was so much stronger than propaganda had admitted that it could afford to feed enemy children better than their own army had fed them. Every breakfast was evidence that the regime had lied, that the war had been unwinnable from the start, that years of suffering could have been avoided if leadership had valued truth over ideology. Ernst wrote letters. Home mail from prisoners was permitted, subject to censorship but otherwise encouraged. He tried to explain to his parents what captivity was like, struggled to convey that American treatment was fair, without sounding like he had been brainwashed or coerced. He described the food carefully. We receive adequate meals. The conditions are acceptable. I am healthy and expect to remain so. He couldn't explain the full truth, that he was eating better as a prisoner in America than he had eaten at home in Berlin for the last 2 years of the war, because such statements seemed impossible even as he lived them. Karl became friends with an older prisoner, a man named Wilhelm, who had been captured in North Africa in 1943 and had spent 2 years in American camps. Wilhelm had advice about surviving captivity. Follow rules, work steadily, but don't overexert. Maintain dignity. Remember that this is temporary. He also had perspective about American treatment that helped Karl understand his experience. They don't hate us personally, Wilhelm explained during an evening conversation. They hate what Germany did, what the regime represented. But they distinguish between leadership and ordinary soldiers. You boys especially, they see you as victims. Children who were conscripted consent to fight in a war you didn't start. So they treat you fairly, feed you properly, make sure you're cared for. It's not personal kindness exactly, more like professional obligation. But the result is the same decent treatment according to international law. The 3rd week brought a change in routine. The camp organized recreational activity sports, mostly. Simple games like volleyball and soccer that gave prisoners exercise and diversion. Hans had never been particularly athletic, but he found himself playing anyway, running and laughing with other boys, in ways that felt strange after months of military discipline and combat trauma. An American guard named Sullivan joined one of the soccer games, playing on the German team because they were short players. Sullivan was young, maybe 22, and good at soccer in the way Americans who grew up playing it were good enthusiastic if not particularly skilled. He joked in broken German, celebrating goals with the same excitement he would have shown playing with American teammates, treating enemy prisoners like regular opponents in a recreational game rather than as defeated enemies requiring constant vigilance. After the game, Sullivan shared his canteen with Hans and several other boys, letting them drink water that tasted of metal and American chlorination. It was a small gesture, meaningless in one sense, but it represented something larger: casual friendship. Across the divide, that war had created acknowledgement that German children and American soldiers could share water and laugh about a soccer game, without hatred or violence intervening. Hans drank the water and handed back the canteen, and Sullivan clapped him on the shoulder, a friendly gesture, not aggressive or dominating, before jogging off to resume his duties. And Hans stood in Colorado sunlight, breathing mountain air, feeling his body slowly recovering from malnutrition and stress, and understood with complete clarity that the regime had lied about everything. About American cruelty, about German superiority, about inevitable victory. Every promise had been false, built on propaganda rather than reality, and the evidence was in every meal, every fair treatment, every small kindness shown by enemies who should have been monsters, but were instead just people doing a difficult job with basic professionalism and occasional unexpected generosity. November brought snow to the Colorado mountains, transforming the camp into something that looked almost picturesque: white, covering wire fences and guard towers, pine trees dusted with frost, the kind of winter scene that would have been beautiful if it weren't framing captivity. The barracks were heated adequately, preventing real suffering, but the cold meant more indoor time, more hours to fill with activity beyond basic work details. The Americans organized educational programs, English classes, taught by volunteers from nearby towns who came to the camp twice a week to help prisoners learn the language. Mathematics and basic science, taught by a former schoolteacher from Ohio who had been assigned to educational services. Even German literature classes, led by a captain named Muller, whose parents had immigrated from Germany, and who wanted prisoners to maintain connection to their culture as positive aspects, while rejecting the regime as ideology. Hans attended English classes because language seemed practical, knowing English would be useful whatever came after captivity and war. The teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was a grandmother from Trinidad who approached teaching German teenagers with the same patience she applied to her own grandchildren. She taught basic phrases, pronunciation, simple conversations about weather and food and daily activities. "Good morning," Hans practiced. "My name is Hans. I am from Germany. I am learning English." The phrases felt strange in his mouth, sounds that didn't follow German patterns, but Mrs. Patterson was encouraging. She corrected pronunciation gently, praised attempts even when they were badly flawed, treated German prisoners like regular students rather than enemy captives who happened to be learning the language of their captors. Ernst struggled more with English. The sounds didn't come naturally to him, and his frustration with mistakes made learning difficult. But Mrs. Patterson was patient, working with him individually, breaking down difficult sounds into smaller components, celebrating small victories like properly pronouncing th sounds that didn't exist in German. During one class, Mrs. Patterson brought photographs from her home pictures of her grandchildren, her house, the town of Trinidad with its main street and church, and ordinary American life. She passed the photographs around, letting German boys see what American civilian life looked like, answering questions about schools and families, and how people lived in a nation that hadn't been bombed or invaded or devastated by years of war. "This is my grandson Tommy," she explained, pointing to a picture of a boy about Hans's age. "He wanted to join the army, but he's too young, 16. By the time he's old enough, this war will be over, and he won't have to fight. I'm grateful for that. Grateful that my grandchildren will grow up in peace." Hans stared at the photograph of a boy his age, American, smiling in front of a house that looked intact and comfortable and normal. Tommy would never be conscripted, would never fight, would never experience what Hans had experienced, because America was going to win and the fighting would end before Tommy reached military age. The contrast was devastating. American children could stay children, while German children had been forced into combat because the regime had run out of adults to sacrifice. The mathematics classes were taught by Lieutenant Anderson, who had been an engineer before the war, and approached teaching with the same systematic methodology he applied to technical problems. He taught practical mathematics measurements and calculations and problem-solving skills that would be useful in reconstruction work. But he also taught by example, demonstrating that knowledge and skill mattered more than ideology, that competence was valuable regardless of national origin. Anderson occasionally brought technical problems from camp operations, calculations about food supplies or fuel efficiency or construction measurements, and worked through them with prisoner students, showing how mathematics applied to real situations. Hans found himself enjoying the classes, his mind engaging with abstract problems in ways that felt clean and pure after months of chaos and combat. One evening, Anderson stayed after class to talk with Hans about his background. Where had he gone to school? What had he studied before conscription? What did he want to do after the war? The questions were personal, but not intrusive, genuine interest rather than interrogation. "I wanted to be an engineer," Hans admitted, "like my father was before." He trailed off, uncertain how to finish the sentence. Before the war? Before the regime had transformed Germany? Before everything had collapsed? "You can still be an engineer," Anderson said. "This war will end. Germany will rebuild. Engineers will be needed. You're young enough that you can still get proper education, learn what you need to know, build a career. Don't let this experience define your entire life. It's something that happened to you, not something that has to determine everything that comes after." The conversation stayed with Hans through subsequent days. Anderson was right. He was only 15, would be 16 soon, still young enough that the war could be a terrible interlude rather than a permanent defining experience. If he survived, If he managed to return home, if Germany stabilized enough to permit normal education and career development, he could still become an engineer. The dream wasn't dead, just postponed by circumstances beyond his control. Captain Muller's German literature classes were the most emotionally complex. Muller taught Goethe and Schiller, Heine and Brecht writers, who represented German culture at its best, before the regime had corrupted literature and art into propaganda tools. He read passages aloud in German that sounded proper and cultured, then discussed themes and historical context and what literature revealed about human nature. These writers, Muller explained in one class, represented the Germany that existed before current leadership took power. They wrote about beauty and truth and human complexity. They believed in progress and enlightenment and the possibility of moral development. This is the Germany worth preserving, the culture of thought and art and intellectual achievement, not the recent ideology that has destroyed so much. Ernst raised his hand hesitantly. But how do we separate them? The culture and the regime, they've been connected for years. Everyone at home thinks they're the same thing. Muller nodded. That's the work that will face Germany after this ends. Separating what's worth preserving from what must be rejected completely. It won't be easy. Many Germans will want to keep everything or reject everything, instead of doing the harder work of discriminating between cultural tradition and recent political corruption. But it's necessary work. Germany has to reclaim its intellectual heritage while acknowledging and rejecting the crimes committed in its name. The conversation continued after class, a dozen boys arguing about German identity and responsibility and how to understand their own role in events they hadn't chosen but had participated in. Muller moderated rather than dictated, encouraging boys to think critically about complex questions without offering simple answers that would short-circuit difficult reflection. Hans found himself thinking about his father, who had been an engineer, and a reader who had owned books by Goethe and Thomas, man who had quietly resisted the regime's attempts to control thought while outwardly complying enough to survive. His father would have appreciated these classes, this attempt to preserve German culture's positive aspects while rejecting its recent corruption, if his father was still alive. Hans hadn't received any letters, didn't know if Hamburg still stood, didn't know if his family had survived the bombing and chaos and collapse. The uncertainty was constant weight, worry that couldn't be resolved through action or thought, just carried through days that blended into weeks that stretched toward an uncertain future. By December, Hans had been at Camp Trinidad for 3 months. Long enough that routines felt normal, that breakfast was expected rather than surprising, that American guards were familiar individuals rather than anonymous enemies. Long enough that his body had recovered from malnutrition, that his mind had begun to process trauma, that he could think about futures that extended beyond mere survival. Christmas brought changes to the camp. The Americans decorated the mess hall with pine branches and paper decorations made by prisoners in craft activities. They served a special dinner turkey and dressing and vegetables and pie, food that would have been lavish in peacetime Germany and seemed almost absurd in a prison camp. Red Cross packages arrived with small gifts, candy and cigarettes and writing materials, tokens that acknowledged prisoners' humanity beyond basic survival needs. Captain Muller organized a Christmas service, Lutheran liturgy in German, allowing prisoners to observe religious traditions that connected them to home and peaceful times. Hans attended, not from renewed faith, but from nostalgia for a world where Christmas meant family and celebration rather than war and captivity. During the service, Muller spoke about redemption, not religious redemption exactly, but personal and national redemption, the possibility of learning from mistakes and building something better from ruins. Germany had failed, he said, but Germans didn't have to fail permanently. The regime had corrupted everything, but individuals could choose to reclaim values and principles that preceded and could survive the regime's collapse. You boys were children when this started, Muller continued. You didn't choose the regime, didn't choose the war, didn't choose to be conscripted and sent to fight. You were victims of decisions made by adults who should have protected you instead of sacrificing you. You bear responsibility for your actions. Everyone does, but you're not responsible for the larger catastrophe. When you return home, you'll have to live with difficult history, but you don't have to let it destroy your futures. The words were meant to be comforting, but they raised uncomfortable questions. What responsibility did Hans bear? He had been conscripted, had fought because refusing meant severe consequences, had surrendered at the first reasonable opportunity. Was that complicity or simple survival? Where was the line between being a victim of circumstances and being a participant in evil systems? He discussed this with Ernst and Karl one evening, 3 boys who had become friends through shared experience and understanding. None of them had wanted to be soldiers. All had been taken from schools and families and thrust into combat they were unprepared for. But they had still followed orders, had still shot at Americans during their brief combat experience, had still been part of military forces that served a regime they now understood was fundamentally evil. We were children, Ernst said, working through the logic. Children don't have full moral responsibility. That's why there are different laws for children and adults. We did what we were forced to do under threat of severe punishment. That's coercion, not choice. But we still did it, Karl countered. We still participated. Can we really say we had no choice when what we're really saying is that we chose compliance over the consequences of resistance? Hans listened to his friends argue, both making valid points, neither fully resolving the tension between victimhood and accountability. Perhaps the tension couldn't be resolved. Perhaps they would have to live with ambiguity, acknowledging both that they had been exploited as children and that exploitation didn't eliminate all moral agency. In January 1946, news began filtering through the camp about tribunals in Europe post-war justice proceedings, addressing leadership responsibility for the regime's crimes. The Americans showed newsreels in the camp's recreation building, documentary footage of tribunal sessions, careful to present the proceedings as legitimate legal process rather than victor's revenge. Hans watched footage of German leaders being held, accountable for decisions and policies that had led to catastrophe and atrocity. The documentary wasn't propaganda. It was sober presentation of evidence and testimony, showing systematic crimes that Hans had heard rumors about, but had never fully understood. The scope was overwhelming millions of civilians persecuted, entire populations targeted, atrocities committed on scales that defied human comprehension. This is what you were told you were fighting for, an American officer explained after the screening. This is what the regime did while promising you glory and victory. You were children, you didn't know. You couldn't have known because information was controlled and censored. But now you know. Now you understand what you were part of, even if your role was small and coerced. The boys sat in stunned silence. Some wept, others stared blankly, unable to process information that contradicted everything they had been taught. Hans felt sick, not from the food he had eaten, but from understanding what he had been connected to, what his service had supported, even if he hadn't personally committed atrocities or known their full extent. That evening, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk thinking about orders he had followed, positions he had defended, the brief combat he had participated in before surrender. He had been fighting to defend a regime that was committing crimes he couldn't have imagined. The defense had been feudal Germany had already lost, and his combat had only prolonged inevitable defeat and perhaps prolonged the suffering of victims who might have been liberated sooner if resistance had collapsed earlier. The moral complexity was crushing. He hadn't been responsible for policy decisions or systematic crimes, but he had been part of the machinery, had been a small component in military forces that enabled the regime to persist and continue its worst actions. The guilt wasn't the same as leadership guilt, but it existed, a weight that would persist through whatever life he built after captivity ended. In February, the Americans announced that prisoner repatriation would begin for youngest captives. Boys under 16 would be returned to Germany first, processed through displacement camps, and eventually reunited with families if families could be located. Hans, now 16, would remain in captivity longer, but the announcement meant that his eventual return was coming, that this American interlude would end, and the difficult work of living in post-regime Germany would begin. He thought about what he would tell his family if they had survived, if he could find them in whatever remained of Hamburg. He would tell them about breakfast, about American abundance that proved propaganda false. He would tell them about fair treatment and education programs and chaplains who offered spiritual guidance without requiring conversion. He would tell them that enemies had shown more care for his welfare than his own military leaders had demonstrated. Would they believe him? Or would they think he had been brainwashed, had become a tool of American propaganda? Hans didn't know, but he would tell the truth anyway, because living with lies, even comfortable lies, was what had destroyed Germany. Truth was difficult and often painful, but it was necessary foundation for building anything better from the ruins. In March, Ernst was called for repatriation processing. At 15, barely, he qualified for the first wave of returns. Hans and Karl said goodbye to their friend, watched him join the transport group that would begin the journey back to Europe, back to Germany, back to whatever remained of the world they had left. Don't forget, Hans told Ernst at their farewell, remember what we learned here. Tell people the truth about American treatment, about how we were fed and housed and educated. Tell them the propaganda was lies. Some people won't believe you, but keep telling the truth anyway. Ernst nodded, eyes bright with tears. I'll remember. I'll tell them. And someday, maybe years from now, we'll meet again in Hamburg or Munich or wherever we end up, and we'll talk about this time like it was a strange dream. But it was real, and I'll make sure people know it was real. Hans watched the transport leave, taking Ernst back toward a devastated homeland and an uncertain future. Then he returned to routines, work details, and English classes and mathematics, lessons and meals that still represented more abundance than seemed possible. He had months remaining in captivity, time to continue learning and recovering and preparing for whatever came next. Hans Becker returned to Germany in September 1946, nearly a year after his arrival at Camp Trinidad. Hamburg was ruins, his family's apartment building destroyed, his father's engineering firm gone, infrastructure collapsed into rubble that would take decades to rebuild. But his mother had survived, living in a displaced persons camp, and his younger sister was alive, staying with relatives in the countryside. The reunion was emotional tears and embraces and hours of stories, trying to span the gap of time apart. Hans told his mother about captivity, about American treatment, about breakfasts that proved German propaganda false. She listened with understanding that surprised him, then explained that she had known the propaganda was lies, had known Germany was losing, had known that sending children to fight was final desperate act of failed leadership. I'm glad they captured you, she said quietly. Better American prisoner than dead German soldier. Better you learn truth through fair treatment than through continued suffering under the regime's lies. Hans found work helping with reconstruction. His engineering knowledge was useful even without formal credentials. He continued his education through correspondence courses and evening classes, slowly building toward the engineering career his father had wanted for him. The work was difficult. Progress was slow, but it was honest work, building rather than destroying, creating futures rather than serving ideologies that had led only to catastrophe. He kept in contact with Ernst and Karl through letters, occasional reunions in rebuilding German cities. They talked about their Camp Trinidad experience, about how American captivity had transformed their understanding of the war and Germany's place in the world. They became advocates for truth-speaking in schools, writing for newspapers, countering myths about German victimhood with honest accounting of what had actually happened. Not everyone wanted to hear truth. Many Germans preferred comfortable lies claims that they hadn't known. that the worst crimes were exaggerated, that Germany had simply lost a military conflict without moral dimension. But Hans and others who had experienced American captivity kept telling their stories, kept insisting on accuracy, kept explaining that propaganda dissolution began with simple things like breakfast served fairly to starving children. In 1952, Hans visited the United States, a tourist trip, nothing official, just personal interest in seeing the nation that had held him captive and treated him fairly. He traveled to Colorado, found Camp Trinidad converted to other uses, the barracks still standing, but repurposed for civilian needs. He stood at what had been the mess hall entrance and remembered that first morning, the fear, the suspicion, the certainty that abundance was a trap. The trap had been real, but not the way he had expected. The trap was that kindness would make him see clearly, that fair treatment would destroy propaganda, that breakfast would prove more powerful than ideology. Americans had trapped him in truth, and the trap had saved him, not just physically through adequate nutrition and medical care, but intellectually and morally through exposure to reality that propaganda had hidden. He spent his life grateful for that trap, for the breakfast that had seemed impossible, for the Americans who had fed starving German children, and in doing so had taught them that everything they had been told about enemies and strength and national character was false. The meal had been simple, just eggs and bacon, and toast and fruit. But it had shattered lies more effectively than any weapon, and Hans carried its lesson through decades of life rebuilt from ruins. That truth persists, that kindness matters, that even small acts of decency can transform understanding and create possibility for something better than hatred and ideology. The breakfast had changed his life. Not dramatically, not in single moment, but through accumulated evidence that built day after day until belief collapsed under the weight of contradictions between propaganda and reality. And Hans spent his remaining years ensuring that others understood this lesson, that truth matters more than comfortable lies that facing. Reality is essential for building futures, worth having, that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the simplest demonstrations of human decency.